Hello, beautiful people, and welcome back to First Generation Flyers, a limited series where I share my journey of recovery from emotional trauma to heal my soul. I'm your host, Vay, and as a reminder, I'm not a licensed professional. I'm just sharing my story and some things I've learned in hopes to help someone else on their journey of life. In the last episode, we talked about mental illness and how trauma rewires the brain so our reality is made up of projections of whatever is unresolved in our hearts. When our hearts are blocked by negative energy, our minds become vulnerable to false narratives about who we are, shaped by an imposter rooted in a negative image of self. After working with my therapist to break down psychological barriers in my mind due to mental illness, I was ready to remove the blocks from my heart. I now understood that my thoughts and views of the world were based on beliefs I inherited as a result of my childhood environment. This meant my negative outlook on self and life in general was dictated long before I came into this world by those who came before me. And if I wanted to change it, I would have to go deep inside my heart to filter through the damage and find what I'd lost sight of so long ago: my soul. The physical world is home to our visible self, or who we are in human form. This is the world our minds project as reality, and where we experience the effects of whatever's happening behind the wall of our hearts in the spirit world. The spirit world is home to our invisible self. This world is protected by our hearts and holds the unfiltered truth of who we are at the core, which is dictated by whatever emotions we choose to hold on to. When we allow ourselves to express the truth of what we feel, we allow ourselves to be seen and to connect with others who share the same authenticity. Like the saying goes, real recognize real. But when we deny those feelings, good or bad, we essentially deny who we are. And if this becomes common practice, we eventually become disconnected from the truth of who we are, as our souls become lost in a sea of rejection and connections that don't feel genuine, and our ego grows to create a false personality that we present to the world to protect the parts of ourselves that have been neglected by love. In Sigmund Freud's model of the psyche, he describes the inner workings of a person's mind as the id, ego, and superego. This construct is the mind's conscious connection to the soul. The id is the part of our psyche that's responsible for our impulsiveness or instinct desires, also known as our subconscious. This part of our mind is developed in early childhood, where habits such as survival and stress responses are formed that we inherit from our environment. This is the part of self that speaks or acts before we think. The superego acts as the self-critical conscious. It reflects the social standards, ethics, and morals we learned from our parents, caregivers, teachers, or religion. This is our higher consciousness and the part of our mind that's responsible for judgment. Unlike the id, who performs instinctively, the superego takes more time to process as it evaluates whatever's happening against what we've been taught to be right or wrong. This is the part of self that thinks before we act or speak. Finally, the ego is the mediator between the two, where we form our perception of reality. This part of our mind is responsible for keeping us safe by suppressing the parts of self we've been taught are bad or that interfere with the vision of ourselves we've created in our minds. The false personality our ego creates to fill whatever roles in life we choose to play can interfere with our connection to self by creating an imbalance between our id, which can be seen as our lower self, and our superego, which can be seen as our higher self. And when this happens, we become susceptible to mental and physical illness driven by the stress of denying the needs and desires of our hearts and minds. Stress is a normal reaction to the demands of life, but when we have poor stress management skills or cope in unhealthy ways, we become targets for its detrimental effects on our health, which can lead to struggles in life and even early death. In Western society, when it comes to treating illness of any kind, our culture is to treat symptoms on the surface and not necessarily deal with the underlying issues causing them to begin with. This is typically because we prefer the comfort of convenience over the discomfort that comes with the lifestyle change usually required for effective treatment that disrupts the reality our ego has created. Utilizing talk therapy as a safe space for my overwhelming emotions, I began to uncover deep-rooted issues and connections between my heart, mind, and soul that facilitated my self-destructive behavior. A common theme in my mental issues was difficulty adjusting to new environments. Because of my career with the military, I moved often, which meant starting over a lot. Even though I left my childhood environment physically, mentally, and emotionally, I was still there because that's where the people who loved me were. Coming from a broken home with an overworked and broken-hearted mother, I was conditioned to live in chronic stress and heartache. So my subconscious mind viewed stress and heartache as comfort because it was familiar. And this was my connection to love. But on a conscious level, I knew these factors contributed to a life of struggle, which I tried to avoid at all costs because of the effects it had on my relationship with my mother growing up. So while my heart was subconsciously drawn to stressful love connections, my mind consciously avoided them. This created conflict in my soul because I wanted love, but I didn't want the stress and heartache that seemed to come along with it. So if I wanted any chance at a different kind of love, or to find comfort in peace instead of chaos, I would need to better understand the source of my pain and my connection to love. So let's get into the dark night of the soul. When psychologist Abraham Maslow came on the scene, he described his work as complementary to Freud's, whose concern, like many other psychologists during that time, was with the abnormal and severely mentally ill. Maslow's focus, however, was on the positive potential of human beings. He believed that every human had a strong desire to reach their full potential, but unmet deficiency needs were roadblocks that caused them to defer focus from pursuing inner growth needs to pursuit of basic and psychological needs for survival. My roadblocks to self-actualization were negative connections to my soul, a broken heart, and an afflicted mind. Because of the wall and distance I put up between the two, my soul became lost beneath the surface as my ego ignored my invisible self and instead focused attention to my human needs of stability and financial security. In Maslow's studies of humanistic psychology, he acknowledged spirituality as a navigation for human behavior, believing that when individuals are in harmony with themselves and their surroundings, they're able to enjoy peak experiences in life. Spirituality is typically associated with our superego or higher consciousness. We tend to ignore or reject the lower consciousness of spirituality because it's usually associated with negativity. And in our culture, negativity is viewed as bad instead of a call to attention to deeper issues within that block personal growth. This is a result of the lens of duality. Religion was the genesis of duality for me because my family were devout followers of Christianity, and Christianity divided the world between heaven and hell, purity versus sin, and good versus bad. There was no middle ground because according to the church, you couldn't serve two masters. This was how my family viewed the world because of the pain and suffering they experienced throughout life in the physical world, which they associated with the work of the devil, and the peace they managed to find in the spiritual one through God and Jesus Christ. So naturally, God became my place of peace whenever my life became too much to bear. Our parents are our first representations of God. They teach us right from wrong, they judge and punish, and they love and protect us. So when my mother rejected me for what she considered to be a sinful relationship with another woman, I felt rejected by God. And when no one in my family came to my defense, and the rest of God's children condemned me to hell, I felt abandoned by love. If God is love and we're created in His image, then I was no longer worthy of protection because I no longer reflected His image of perfection. I was now a reflection of the devil and the world of sin my family wanted no parts of. And because I already carried the pain of rejection from my father and his family, my mother was all I had. So I had no choice but to suppress the pain I felt from her to keep from falling apart. In doing so, this created an imbalance in my personality. The heaviness of my heart, weighed down with shame and hate for myself, split my soul in two as my higher consciousness rejected this part of myself that was no longer worthy of love. But just because I rejected it, didn't make it go away. These suppressed emotions caused the shadow side of my soul, better known as my lower self, to rebel in the form of self-destructive behavior, as well as forming connections to toxic relationships as a subconscious reminder that I had been traumatized by love. Generational trauma refers to trauma that's passed on from a trauma survivor to their descendants. People who experience generational trauma can develop symptoms, reactions, patterns, and emotional and psychological effects from traumatic events experienced by previous generations. Human evolution is defined by our ability to adapt to changing environments. If we live in chronic stress or experience a traumatic event, our sympathetic nervous system triggers our fight or flight response that activates whenever our brains perceive a threat to our survival. It's our built-in alarm system to let us know something is wrong. To reset this alarm, the body needs to rest and digest to allow blood pressure, heart rate, and hormone flow to return to normal levels. But if we're stuck in survival mode because of chronic stress or unresolved trauma, the brain is conditioned to remain on high alert and the sympathetic nervous system remains active, which can cause serious complications to our physical and mental health related to hypertension, diabetes, obesity, anxiety, and mood regulation, as well as heart disease, which is the leading cause of death amongst Americans. Living in survival mode limits our ability to grow and adapt to new environments because the brain is wired to constantly look for threats in fear of the trauma being repeated. In doing so, the mind subconsciously recreates the experience using new relationships and surroundings to project old feelings we're still holding on to. And if we haven't allowed our minds to rest and reset, we carry the same problems and fears from one situation to the next, which conditions us to disappointment and unhappiness. Survival mode unconsciously forces us to cling to familiarity because predictability gives us control, and control makes us feel safe. Many generations before ours didn't have the tools, energy, examples, or the mind space to manage the stressors of life or the traumatic effects of historical oppression and struggle. Growing up in a household where arguing, yelling, emotional and physical abuse or neglect is normalized, this can become adaptive behavior of unhealthy stress responses and patterns because that's how our parents, their parents, and the parents before them did it. Shutting down and becoming aggressive or confrontational when there wasn't an immediate threat were stress responses I inherited to deal with overwhelming emotions. In those moments, it was as if I was temporarily overtaken by someone or something else, unable to control my behavior, just as it did with my suicidal episodes. After the moment passed, I was usually left with feelings of emptiness and regret because that behavior usually surfaced whenever I tried to open a certain part of my heart to someone, the part that connected me to my soul. A year after living in Ohio, I got a call that after 10 years of decline from dementia, my grandmother was being moved to hospice. I had mixed feelings about the news because on one hand, I had already made peace with my grandmother's transition when she stopped speaking 4 years earlier. But on the other hand, I empathized with what my mother was about to go through because she and my grandmother were as close as me and her once were. I took on the planning of her final arrangements to help lessen the load as much as I could. But when I sat down to write her obituary, I realized I didn't know anything about her beyond her birthday and that I didn't have a relationship with anyone else in her family. And my mother and aunt weren't 100% sure of the answers. Also, they didn't like talking about the past. It usually triggered unresolved feelings that left them on edge, so I learned to stop asking about it. With slavery robbing many Black American families of their history, our stories were all we had to be remembered by. And I didn't want my grandmother to leave this earth with a generic obituary as if her life didn't matter. So I took a long shot and found one of my mom's brothers on social media who'd been disconnected from the family for years. Our conversations uncovered the childhoods him and his siblings survived. His stories gave me an opportunity to see them as the children, teenagers, and young adults I never got to meet but wanted to know. He also shared stories I'd never heard of my grandmother as a young single mother, the struggle she endured, and the effects they had on the household growing up. The more I learned, the deeper I wanted to go because I was finding that a lot of the issues I've battled with most of my life seemed to have a lot to do with a family past I knew nothing about. But the deeper I went, the more broken connections I found, and the more I understood how and why my family had become so isolated in the first place. The intense amount of hurt and pain I'd experienced throughout life that didn't seem to have a source was all starting to make sense. And the more sense it made, the more inevitable my fate became that the brokenness I felt inside was something I would never be able to escape because it was rooted in my DNA. As I dug into my family's history all the way back to the early 1900s, I also got reacquainted with American history and the things going on in the world outside the home that affected life inside. Jim Crow laws that legalized segregation, the Great Depression that further crippled Black Americans, where race relations called for Blacks to be fired from jobs as long as whites were out of work, the dawn of the divorce revolution that made it easier for people to leave toxic marriages, the birth of the civil rights movement where Blacks fought to be treated equally in this country, and the genesis of America's war on drugs that initiated the crack epidemic that polluted the Black community. Living in a world that denied you basic rights and condoned hatred because of the color of your skin was reflected in many Black households during that time through chronic stress, drug and alcohol abuse, domestic violence, and child abuse. Growing up in those conditions, it was hard to see the world as anything other than a terrible place, or to see yourself as anything other than unloved. This was my legacy. These were the conditions that my soul was descended from. And this was my root connection to love and to self. Roots my mother and aunt worked hard to move away from, to disconnect their children from, to give us an opportunity to have a childhood worth remembering, something neither of them had. But this connection to my roots is something I spent my entire life wanting to know, so that maybe I could finally understand myself. Connection is an often overlooked but vital piece of human survival. It's critical to our personal growth and key to satisfaction in life. If our connection to family is unhealthy or is painful, then so is our connection to life, because that root connection teaches us how to connect with ourselves and how to connect with others, and is our model for how we form intimacy. When that connection doesn't exist or is broken for whatever reason, death, trauma, abandonment, etc., we subconsciously begin to search for a replacement, usually in the form of a romantic partner, to gain a sense of closeness and oneness with self, to find harmony and to find peace. But when our core beliefs about who we are is rooted in pain or negativity, we struggle to make positive and fruitful connections. When I moved to Ohio, I met the person I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. But the trust and abandonment issues I struggled with, combined with my unhealthy stress responses inherited as a result of generational trauma, created a toxic environment that forced us to end the relationship to prevent hurting each other any further. The reality of another failed relationship, even after all the work I was doing on myself, left me with the conclusion that I was just too broken to love. But the truth was, I didn't need a relationship partner. I needed to heal. After spending Christmas during a pandemic with my best friend and her family, the thought of going back to my home in Ohio, filled with memories of my ex and reminders of my mental instability, was terrifying. So I took an impromptu trip to LA instead. Running away was how I best dealt with emotions I didn't understand. It was easier to face my torment in isolation than it was to deal with the ridicule and judgment from others. Growing up, I was teased a lot for my sensitive nature, so I learned to keep my emotions to myself. But at this point, more than anything, I was embarrassed. I always thought once I reached a certain point in life, love would find me and everything else would fall into place. But despite the success I achieved on the outside, my inside world was falling apart. During my escape to LA, I had a conversation with my brother where he reminded me of a memory I'd forgotten that had a lasting impact on him growing up. For the life of me, I couldn't remember it. In fact, I had forgotten I spent 2 years of my early childhood living with my dad and siblings all together. But once I was able to finally recall that memory, it was as if Pandora's box that held all my childhood secrets was open. The work I had been doing in therapy to restore the connection between my heart and mind had made room for more lost memories that had somehow been forgotten. A lot of them related to my relationship with my mother. Growing up, she could do no wrong in my eyes because she was my savior. She stayed when my father didn't, and she'd been through a lot just to take care of me. But what I learned about trauma bonds is they can be developed when a person relies on an abusive person to fulfill emotional needs. Children rely on their parents for love and support. So if the parent is neglectful or abusive in any way, the child associates this with love. And without knowing any better, the child is unable to see that this association isn't normal. So instead, they may blame themselves to make sense of the neglect or abuse that's happening, while the parent continues to be good in the child's eyes because they continue to rely on that parent for love and support. The unresolved trauma of abuse from previous generations of my family left me emotionally neglected. As a kid, I didn't understand the emotional void in my family. I didn't understand how people could say they loved you, then hurt you, and continue the relationship with no remorse. But this was normalized behavior I learned to adapt to, believing that love wasn't supposed to feel good. It was just supposed to be there. And if it didn't hurt, then it wasn't real. This was behavior I carried into every intimate relationship I had throughout life. Toxic cycles of hurting people and calling it love because the other person had nowhere else to go. But that wasn't love. That was control and manipulation. I was starting to see things differently. It was as if the rose-colored lens I viewed me and my mother's relationship from had come off, and I was able to see things for what they truly were. And the truth was, I didn't feel safe with her. It was a hard reality to face, as I recalled experiences growing up where I didn't feel safe, was afraid, or felt hurt, and how she dismissed them as either my fault or invalidated them because those things happened to everybody. When I tried to address wounds that were still open as an adult, my mother didn't understand their relevance to the present. My family's survival response to pain was to leave it where it was, pick up whatever pieces you could salvage, and continue to survive. Their hearts had become hardened to their own pain, so they couldn't recognize the pain they inflicted on the closest reflections of themselves. In their eyes, whatever happened in the past didn't matter if you made it through it. But there was a difference between living and surviving. When we don't get the proper love and support from situations that make us feel unsafe, our ego grows to create a shell around our inner child to shield us from further pain. And if we don't have a constructive outlet for that pain, we project it onto others. The unwanted memories I locked away from painful experiences in my past were the foundation for why I never felt safe or comfortable around men, why I couldn't trust anyone who said they loved me, and why I couldn't love myself. It really bothered me that this was something she couldn't see, that she couldn't understand how hurtful her behavior could be and the impact it had on my own happiness and quality of life. But my therapist pointed out that it could be something she would never understand in his lifetime. And continuing to seek validation or the love I needed from her or anyone else incapable of reciprocating those needs was a toxic cycle of self-punishment I had fallen into because somewhere deep inside, there was something I couldn't forgive myself for. That was heavy, because as close as we'd been growing up, I never in a million years would have considered the fact that my mother could be incapable of loving me the way I needed to be loved. Because if she couldn't love me, then who could? As I began to peel back the layers of my heart, I started to reevaluate my past relationships with love and realized I had a pattern of expecting people to love me the way I needed to be loved just because that was how I loved them. And that was the cause of my suffering. I was spending all of my energy giving away the love I needed for myself. After being cut off from God, I searched for peace at the bottom of every alcohol bottle I could find until I finally realized the only thing that was there was more pain. So I started looking into alternative forms of spirituality to escape the demons that haunted me, as I learned therapy alone wasn't enough to heal all that was broken within. When I lived in LA, I discovered Eastern religions Hinduism and Buddhism. Hinduism is about understanding God within self. Reaching our highest self is a process of removing the physical distractions from life, allowing one to eventually understand the nature of God within. Buddhism is about overcoming the suffering of life by transcending human existence through enlightenment, inner peace, and wisdom of truth to realize nirvana, where suffering no longer exists and an individual is released from the effects of karma and the cycle of death and rebirth, also known as reincarnation. Both religions practice the concept of healing through meditation and a balance of chakras. The chakra system refers to 7 main energy centers that run along the spine. The belief is that the body and mind mutually affect each other, and many of our physical symptoms, mental and physical illnesses, are expressions of what hasn't been addressed in the energy body. I also came across a book called Awaken into the Spirit World, a shamanic path to direct revelation. Shamanism is considered to be the most ancient spiritual practice known to humankind and is the ancestor of all modern religions. Shamans are often defined as a mediator between the physical and spiritual worlds, similar to a priest or a pastor. But unlike organized religions that dictate rules of morality to live by, the shamanic path offered practical guidance and direction to facilitate healing of the body and mind from within through spirituality. And it started with opening the heart. When our ego personality is created to protect the truth of who we are, it does this by shutting down the heart. Oftentimes, our hearts are shut off because they've been rejected by the outside world, leading to internal feelings of hurt or disappointment. This creates the pain we subconsciously carry in the energy centers of our chakras. I learned that when we disrupt the connections to our soul through our hearts and minds, our energy becomes unbalanced and our bodies respond through physical and psychological symptoms. Like Maslow's hierarchy, the chakra system uses a bottoms-up approach from the root chakra that's located at the base of the spine and is responsible for our sense of safety and security, all the way to the crown chakra that's located at the top of the head, which is our source of enlightenment and spiritual connection to consciousness and the divine energy that creates the universe. If we can pinpoint the energy center of which areas are blocked or unbalanced, we can promote healing in the physical and psychological areas of our lives to achieve happiness and fulfillment. Most people have a blocked heart chakra, which is located at the center of our chest and is the meeting point of the physical and spiritual. This chakra is responsible for the love of self and others, compassion, empathy, and forgiveness. When it's blocked by negative energy, we give way to grief, anger, jealousy, and hate towards self and others. As I correlated the chakras below the heart to my lower self, which were responsible for my safety, emotions, and self-esteem, and the ones above my heart to my higher self, which were responsible for communication, intuition, and enlightenment, I learned that all of my lower chakras were blocked because that was the part of myself that had been rejected. And in turn, my upper chakras were overactive because that was the part of myself that had been accepted. This imbalance of energy in my inner world was reflected through my personality disorder and behavior issues in my outer world. And these were representations of the fragmented pieces of my soul. The soul is the essence of who we are that gives life to our human experience through our hearts and minds, led by our spirit. It becomes fragmented when our hearts and minds become disconnected or are in conflict with each other, splitting the soul between higher and lower self, making room for the ego to appear and fill the gap. These fragments become altered versions of our personalities, created as defense mechanisms to protect our inner child that's been neglected. I learned to alter pieces of myself based on what I'd been taught was good or bad in order to fit wherever anyone was willing to accept me. This conditioned me to love the parts of myself people liked and reject the parts they didn't, which made way for my shadow self to take form, who eventually became the imposter in my head. The shadow self is the suppressed parts of ourselves, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that we think society will disapprove of, which are pushed away into our subconscious or our lower selves. While on the surface, it may seem like suppressing negative traits are a good way to cope with unpleasant experiences, this increases the power the shadow has over us, unconsciously directing our decisions in life. The shadow self manifests in physical and psychological issues such as depression, chronic illnesses, and low self-esteem. Psychologist Carl Jung suggests suppressing the shadow self can prevent us from reaching our full potential. He writes, "This is particularly true when specific character traits have been suppressed due to low self-esteem, anxiety, or negative core beliefs. Our belief systems are most often rooted in our childhood, and once we've learned that a particular behavior or character trait is bad, it's difficult to change this view. Frequently, the shadow personality consists of rejected parts of our character that we've deemed to be weaknesses in self, rather than traits that we need to overcome. I grew up in an environment where the only emotion authentically expressed was anger. It's the only way to be heard, because it's the universal language of survival. So my shadow self was overflowing with every other suppressed emotion like an exposed nerve, sensitive to everything around me. As I dug deep to peel back these layers of self, my therapist was critical support during this time. She helped me understand that the neglect and false sense of security I experienced throughout childhood had nothing to do with me being bad, deserving to be hurt, or being unlovable. and everything to do with my environment and cycles of unhealthy stress responses from adults who were doing the best they could to recover from their own childhoods and unhealed traumas. As humans, we're naturally afraid of things we don't understand. All traumas are rooted in fear. Because I didn't understand the suppressed parts of myself or my emotions, they scared me and caused me to run, ignore, or suppress them even further, until they drove me to mental distress and led me to suicidal behavior. My experience with Christianity taught me division, judgment, and condemnation of self. It taught me that I was bad for having feelings I didn't understand, that good and bad couldn't coexist, and that God was good and the devil was bad. But spirituality taught me that both good and bad, God and the devil, all resided within, and were nothing more than a reflection of my inner peace or inner conflict, depending on the feelings I had for myself. And the feelings I had for myself were heavily influenced by the people that made up the world around me. My family rejected their devils. They cast them away and didn't look back. That worked for them. It helped them find peace. But that didn't work for me because my devil tried to kill me. So instead, I embraced mine to understand it and find out what it wanted. And I came to find that it wanted the same thing as everyone else, to be loved and to be accepted. Relationships are reflections of our soul, our hearts, our minds, and our higher and lower selves. They reflect our connection to love, life, and self. Motivational speaker Jim Rohns suggests we are the average of the 5 people we spend the most time with. So the way we think, how we feel about ourselves, and the decisions we make in life are greatly influenced by the people we surround ourselves with. And we're naturally attracted to people who reflect who we are, who we've been, or who we wish to become. Having a newfound understanding of the depths of my pain and the effects of trauma led me to reevaluate all of my relationships and connections. As I lingered in the space of my lower self, only able to see the world through a lens of negativity, they all reflected the hurt I had for myself and my family, and the anger I held toward the world. And the anger tore me apart inside because really the only thing I wanted was to be loved for me. But I learned you can never be good enough for someone who isn't good enough for themselves. So how could I expect someone to love me for me when I didn't even love all of myself? I guess deep down, the darkest part of my soul wanted to be saved from myself. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Just to recap, we talked about the 3 parts of the mind, the id, superego, and ego, and how they reflect the consciousness of our lower and higher selves and the false personality we create to protect the truth of who we are. We talked about generational trauma and how trauma responses can be inherited by future generations even without them experiencing the traumatic event themselves. We also talked about how unresolved trauma and living with chronic stress can keep us stuck in a loop of survival, leading to physical and mental illness that affect our overall quality of life. I introduced my experience with alternative forms of spirituality and healing through balancing of the chakra system and how a blocked heart can disconnect us from our soul. When we hide our emotions or the truth of what we feel, we become invisible. When we don't feel safe, we hide who we are to protect our inner child that's been neglected. And if we don't learn how to process our pain in a healthy way, or if we continue the habit of suppressing what hurts, we create a shadow of who we are to carry those negative feelings, which can then manifest in destructive behavior. As much as I wanted to be loved, I first needed to heal from the pain in my source connection to life, because every connection to love in my life extended from that pain. And if I wanted a different kind of love, one that didn't hurt, I would have to resolve the conflict between my heart and mind to rebuild the broken connections to my soul. And that's what we'll get into next time when we talk about grief and letting go. As always, I hope you found this content enlightening, and if you learned something useful to take along your journey, make sure you find your way back so you don't miss out on what's to come. Until next time, be safe, be loved, be you. Dope responsibly. Peace. I keep running from my demons. I'm running, 'cause the devil keep coming for me. I can't stop running. turn the corner, I feel like I'm being hunted. So I just keep running.